This video will explain how you can use Leap Salesforce to easily set up test automation. Leap Salesforce is a Ruby gem that makes it easy to set up automated test frameworks against Salesforce. To start creating test automation, we'll first start by setting up an OAuth app which will enable API testing. This gem heavily relies upon API testing to read the metadata and to perform API tests. As you can see, we have one here already set up for our demo. On your dev environment where you build your test automation, you'll need Ruby installed. Here I show using RVM, a Ruby version manager. We're creating a folder for our demo, navigating to that folder, and then installing the gem from Ruby Gems into our current environment. Then we'll run an initialization script that will set up all the base folders by connecting to Salesforce, as you'll see. So we have set up a prod environment, so we'll enter prod to show that we can connect. Then we're entering our credentials here that we've got from our OAuth application we created. We enter the password of our test user, and we'll find a user in Salesforce with that password, obviously, that is an admin user, so it can have full access to the metadata to set up our test automation framework. And then once we enter that user, we'll see that it tests that those credentials can successfully authenticate to OAuth. Now we'll give a key for this user. We'll use admin as our admin user, and straight away after that you'll see that this initialization script starts to create basic files, gem files where our dependencies are stored, and from those dependencies installs all of the gems that this library depends on, and then you can see that it's starting to create SOQL objects. So these are the objects representing Salesforce objects that create objects in Ruby code, and now it's creating enums, pick list values from the metadata as well. Basically, by reading the metadata, all of the drop downs, pick lists will be created. Here we can see files, folders it's created. If I use tree, I can see a whole lot is being created. Some of it's quite generic, like gem files where the dependencies are. Rake file is where different tasks that you can perform are. Config is where we store all the configuration. Credentials won't be in source control, it's where the credentials stored previously were stored. This is the environments you can configure per environment. So in this lib folder we have factories that enable you to set up data of different traits for your tests, and then below that we have this metadata folder which is auto-generated based upon the objects that you specify. All of the pick lists have their data recorded so you can reference it in the code and compare it when it changes. And the SOQL data is the objects you specify. Ruby classes are created to map to them, and their field names are recorded to easily access those with your own identifiers. Traffic is logged here, and then we have tests that enable you to easily get started testing by following their example. In RubyMine, this is Ruby IDE that will make it easy for us to create and maintain tests. So the key file in that test automation framework that we just created is called .leapsalesforce.yaml. So in here you see an array of SOQL objects. So these are Ruby classes that map to an object in Salesforce. So say for instance there was a Salesforce object called box_c, a custom object, and then we want to represent it with a class called box. Just add a line like this, and then run a rake task, and that would, from the metadata, create so-called objects to represent it in this folder here, which we'll cover soon. So before we do that, let's have a look at the spec folder. So this spec folder shows some basic tests in RSpec as an example to help get you started. Although this is written in RSpec, any Ruby test framework could be used. So here you can see this is describing contact and CRUD contact, that's create, read, update, and destroy. So here we can see an example of creating an entity, a contact, using factory bot. So this is the factory we talked about just before, and we create a contact, and if we look at this contact, the default trait for a contact just has last name and first name. Here we can see we're creating it using this library called faker, which this method here is basically just creating some random text to fill the first and last name fields, and we're specifying first name to be 40 characters and last name to be 80. So we're kind of pushing the limits of the contact field. And if I want to run it, RubyMine, to run an RSpec test, I just click on it and click play. And so you can see contact CRUD is the test group, and the test name is create using factory bot. So we can see that passed, and the log for it is shown in this logs folder. We can look at this log here. So we can see initially we're using this user, we authenticated to Salesforce, we're creating a factory for contact, and the request body, using that faker library, you can see it's at the last name field and the first name field, and it's sent that as a post to Salesforce using the REST API, got a 201 created, and we've got this ID. Now as part of the test, it also deletes it to clean up data afterwards, which you can see here in this after step. To modify this test here to create an adult. So an adult, we'll say, has a birth date that is greater than 18. So here we'll add a trait called adult, and in there, if I search for all of these fields, which was auto-generated based on metadata, I've got one called birth date. So I'm going to drag that up, put that into this adult trait, and then I can then say, okay, maybe I'm just going to say 19 years ago. So this is a nice human readable way of setting a date. And then I can get this trait name, and inside here I can just put a comma and then put the trait name. And then so when I rerun this test, I should then see that if I look at the traffic logs, that the birth date that was set is 19 years ago, 2002. Yes, great. And if I then, let's say I wanted to read that contact, I can then use this code. Well, yeah, I can just refer to this contact. Let's say I say full name, then this from the fields of contact, you can see full name is referenced here. It's referring to backend name, and I would expect that to be composed of both the first name and the last name of that user. Now, because it's random and we didn't store those, values, we have to explicitly specify. So I can specify that here. If I specify that to be an explicit value, then I can add an expectation like this: full name to equal, it should be the combination of these two fields. So now I'm adding a trait, explicitly specifying and overriding two values in that trait, and then adding an expectation. So then if I run this test, then what we'll see in this full name method, because it won't know what that full name method is, it should have used the ID that it received and then looked up that contact and then ensured that that full name is as expected. So if we look at the log file, we can see here that the request body, again we're creating an adult for this name, and then it got this ID and it used this ID here to look up that object. And then it inspected all of this JSON and found that the name is in fact the first and last name altogether. So hopefully in this way you see how you can very easily, very fast construct tests. Add an entity in Delete Salesforce. So in my org I have a broker entity. So in my code I'm going to call them broker, and the backend name is broker _c. Now, in order to then create objects that map to this, if I look at the rake tasks available to me using rake command line, you'll see the tasks that are imported from this leap Salesforce/rake. So here you can see that we've got this check OAuth, so we can check that OAuth is working. We can create circle objects. We can create pick lists or enumeration objects for those. So let's run this rake task here. Create circle objects. So that will go through and read all of these objects. If the field names have been updated or added, then it will add to this list of field names. So this is a file that you probably don't want to modify because it could change. So if you did want to modify anything, it's better to use this field. So you can see here that these files already exist. Nothing's worrying about it. It's not changing them. It will update these fields if there are difference in field names, and you can see it created this broker class, and then I can see easily the field names. You've got familiar with API testing, but you might ask, what about UI testing? So this is where the gem Leap Salesforce UI comes in. So again, if I install that gem, there's an initialization script to create the basic structure for me to get started as soon as possible with UI testing. So I'll call the init task on this executable. And you can see it appends to my existing files, and then based upon what's in .leet Salesforce, it creates page objects. So we created that new object called broker here, so you can see that it created a broker create page, broker view page, and a broker update page. You see these page objects look pretty empty. You can fill them out yourself, but the real magic happens when through reading the metadata, the Salesforce UI knows how to set the field. Some of those files that were just created or added to. So in the spec helper, you can see that this is the 2 lines that are added by Leap Salesforce itself that sets the API user to the user that we set up, and all of these lines are added by Leap Salesforce UI. So this command here sets the user before each test to the first user of your list of test users, which generally you set up here. And so obviously you can modify this to suit your tests, and then this will start in a browser passing in the test name to that browser, and then after it, if there's a screenshot, it will save that. If there's an exception, it will save that to a file so that you can look at what went wrong. So now let's look at this UI test. So this is an example of creating a record. It will populate a form and save it. So here we've got a dependent record and account. So first we're using FactoryBot again to create an account, and then create contact page, we're visiting that page, and we want to submit the form, filling in all of these fields. Now this shows an example. You can use the label itself to set the field. Based on the label, it will read the metadata, work out what field you want to set, what type of field it is, and then set that field on the UI. These here are using the accesses which correspond to the field names that you'll see here. For example, last name, first name. The more Ruby looking accesses to access those fields. And then this account ID is a reference to another object, which will be getting the account name of this created account to fill on the UI. Then storing the contact ID and then finding it via the API and checking that in the back end all the fields that we set on the UI, which are created with random data up here, are equal to the data that we set on the UI. And this one here, it's the more complicated one, the reference data, so we check the account ID is equal to the account that we set up here, because we specified a name, which should create so it's unique. Okay, so let's run this test again by pushing play, and it will download Chrome driver. It's not already installed using the WebDrivers gem. As long as you've got Chrome installed, this should work. And you can see it logged in to Salesforce. Open a new contact page, it's filling out all of these fields, filled in reference field, created that new contact, and then validated them. And because so much going on, there's a logger that logs everything. So you can see it's logging in as this user visiting that page. It worked out that first name is a text field, so then it set it. And so under the last name, this is a pick list, so it set that, this is a text area, and it set that reference field, searching by this account name which was created. So there you have it. Test automation and Salesforce made easy. Thank you for watching.